He came to honor the man who saved him and would give his life to protect the woman he left behind. Ethan had not expected to feel this way. When he first made the decision to return, he thought it would be a simple task. Honor the man who saved his life, leave a token of gratitude, and then quietly walk away. But as his boots crunched against the dusty path that led to the small, quiet town, the weight of the years and the promise he had made grew heavier. He had made a promise to a man who had sacrificed everything for him, to look after his wife and children if anything ever happened to him. Ethan had never expected to be standing here now, about to fulfill that promise. It had been 5 long years since that day, the day when his life had been saved, and the day he lost Jack, the man who had been his friend, his comrade, and his savior. The memory of that day was still fresh in his mind. The sounds of the explosions, the smoke that choked his breath, and the feeling of the ground beneath him as he was knocked unconscious. When he woke up, it was Jack's face above him, his voice calm and steady, assuring him that they would make it out of there. But they hadn't. Jack had done the impossible. He had pulled Ethan from the wreckage, carried him when Ethan could barely stand, and kept him alive when it seemed there was no hope. Jack had protected him, putting his own life at risk without a second thought. And yet, in the end, it was Jack who paid the price.
Ethan didn't remember much after that, but the one thing that stayed with him was Jack's voice before everything went dark. "If I don't make it out, you promise me
you'll take care of Sarah."
Ethan had promised, of course.
He had made the promise without hesitation, because that was the kind of man Jack was. He didn't ask for much, only that Ethan keep his word. But now, standing on the outskirts of that quiet town, Ethan found himself questioning if he could ever truly live up to the promise he had made. He hadn't seen Sarah since that day. Back then she had been a strong, loving woman, but she had been shattered by Jack's death. It was easy to imagine how much time had passed, how much her life had changed. She had lost her partner, the man who had shared every moment with her, and now she had to raise their children alone. Ethan knew the pain of losing someone close to him, but he couldn't fully understand what it had been like for Sarah. Ethan walked into town, passing by familiar buildings, but everything felt different. The town had changed in ways that he hadn't expected. There were new shops, new faces, but the old, quiet charm remained. People went about their business unaware of the heavy heart that Ethan carried. He didn't expect anyone to recognize him. It had been years, and he had changed. His once youthful face was now lined with age and sorrow. The years had added weight to his frame and a shadow to his eyes. He found the small house where Jack and Sarah had once lived, the house that Jack had worked so hard to build, the house that had been full of laughter and love before tragedy struck. Ethan paused in front of it, unsure of what to do next. Should he knock? Should he introduce himself as the man who owed everything to the man who had once lived here? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that he had come to honor Jack, to honor the man who had saved him from certain death. Taking a deep breath, he walked up to the door and knocked. The sound echoed through the empty street, and for a moment it felt as though the world had stopped. When the door opened, Ethan's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in front of him, was Sarah. She looked different, of course. She had aged as well, but there was something in her eyes that hadn't changed, the same strength and resilience he had always admired in her. For a brief moment they both just stood there, staring at each other, neither knowing what to say. "Ethan?" Sarah's voice was soft, unsure, but she didn't step back. She didn't slam the door in his face. She simply stood there, looking at him as if she could hardly believe it. "Sarah," Ethan replied, his voice thick with emotion. He wasn't sure what he had expected, but this was harder than he thought it would be. "I came to honor Jack. I promised him I'd come back." She nodded slowly, the grief in her eyes flaring up for a moment before she blinked it away. "Jack would have wanted you to. Come in, please." She stepped aside, and Ethan entered the house. The interior was much as he remembered it, though it seemed quieter now, emptier. The house had been filled with love once, and now there was only the silence of loss. They sat at the kitchen table, neither of them knowing where to begin. Sarah offered him a drink, but he declined, his throat tight. He didn't want to think about the years he had missed, about the life that Jack had left behind. Sarah was different now. The carefree smile that used to light up her face was gone, replaced by a look of weary determination. She had raised their children, kept their lives together despite the heartache. Ethan could feel the weight of the promise he had made, but he wasn't sure if he was ready for the responsibility that came with it. How could he, a man who had barely managed to survive, offer anything to someone like Sarah? She deserved so much more than a man who could hardly make sense of his own life. The conversation was slow to start, but eventually they talked. They talked about Jack, about the past, about the love they had shared. Sarah spoke of Jack with fondness, but there was a deep sorrow in her voice, a sorrow that came from losing him and learning to live without him. She had raised their children with strength, but there was a sadness in her eyes that never quite left. Ethan listened, his heart heavy with the realization of just how much she had carried on her own. He wanted to help, but he didn't know how. Jack had been the strong one, the protector. Now it seemed that Ethan was the one who needed protection, from the guilt, from the promise he had made, from the haunting memories of war and loss. As they spoke, the minutes turned into hours, and Ethan began to realize that this was not going to be an easy journey. The promise he had made to Jack was more than just a debt. It was a commitment to the woman Jack had loved, a commitment to a family he didn't fully know, but that now felt like his responsibility. It was a burden he hadn't anticipated, but one he would bear, because he owed Jack everything. By the time Ethan left Sarah's house, it was late. The town was quiet, and the moon hung low in the sky. Ethan stood in front of the house, the weight of the day settling heavily on his shoulders. He had come to honor Jack, but what he had found was something deeper. He had come to honor a promise, yes, but he also had come to face the truth, that he wasn't just a man who had survived an attack. He was a man with a responsibility now, and that responsibility wasn't just about protecting Sarah. It was about honoring Jack's legacy in the way that mattered most, by living up to the promise he had made. As Ethan made his way back down the path, he couldn't help but feel a shift in his heart. He had come here to honor Jack, but he had stayed for something more. He had stayed to protect what Jack had left behind. The day Ethan met Sarah again was one he had never imagined. He had returned to the small town to honor a promise he had made years ago, but it wasn't just a promise to a man who had saved his life. It was a promise to a family he barely knew, a family that had lost everything when Jack died, and now they were his responsibility. But as he sat in the dimly lit living room, speaking with Sarah, memories from the past flooded back. Ethan had never been one to talk much about the war, not to anyone. It was too painful. The men he had fought alongside were his brothers in arms, but Jack had been different. He had always been different. There was something about Jack's calm demeanor that had made him stand out. In the chaos of the battlefield, Jack was steady. While others panicked, Jack remained focused. Ethan remembered watching him in action, moving through dangerous territory with a sense of purpose. He wasn't afraid. He never showed fear. Ethan had always admired that about Jack. It wasn't until that fateful day when the ambush came that Ethan truly understood what it meant to be selfless. He had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and before he could react, explosions rocked the ground beneath him. He was thrown into the dirt, unconscious from the blast. When he woke, everything was quiet. The smoke was thick, and his head pounded with pain. He tried to stand, but his legs wouldn't move. Panic set in. That's when he heard it. "Ethan, stay with me," a familiar voice said. It was Jack. Ethan had always thought of him as strong and capable, but in that moment, Jack's voice carried a kind of calm assurance that Ethan could trust. Jack had saved him, dragging him from the wreckage when the rest of the world seemed to be falling apart around them. Ethan never really understood why Jack had done it. Why had he risked his life to save someone else's? Jack had simply said, "You're not alone. We'll make it." But they hadn't. Jack had made sure Ethan was safe, but Jack didn't make it out of the blast zone. Ethan had woken up in a field hospital, injured but alive. Jack had been buried far from home, in a foreign land. Ethan had carried the weight of that loss ever since. Years passed. Ethan went through rehabilitation, trying to find his way back to some sort of normal. He tried to forget about the war, but the memories stayed with him, constantly lingering in the back of his mind. Every time he thought of Jack, the guilt would eat at him. Jack had given his life for him, and what had he done with it? Ethan hadn't been able to answer that question for a long time. Now, sitting in Sarah's home, Ethan couldn't help but think about those days. How had she managed after Jack's death? How had she lived without the man who had been her everything? Ethan looked at Sarah, the woman who had once been full of laughter and life. She had been the one to bring joy to Jack's life, the one he had loved and built a life with. And now, Sarah was left alone to carry on. At first, their conversation had been awkward. There was so much unspoken between them. So many years of pain and loss. Sarah spoke of Jack with a quiet reverence, a love that never seemed to fade, even after all these years. But Ethan could see it in her eyes. There was a deep sadness there. She had lost her partner, and it seemed like she had been carrying that burden by herself for a long time. As they talked, Ethan found himself opening up more than he ever had before. Sarah asked about the war, and for the first time, Ethan didn't shy away from the memories. He told her about the days leading up to the attack, about the bond he had shared with Jack. He explained how Jack had been a natural leader, always calm under pressure, always putting others before himself. It was strange, talking about Jack in this way, without the weight of guilt that usually clung to those memories. But something about being in Sarah's presence made him feel like he could finally speak the truth. He could finally honor Jack's memory without feeling like he was burdened by it. Sarah listened carefully, never interrupting it. It was as if she was waiting for him to say everything he needed to say. When he was finished, she took a deep breath, and for the first time since Ethan had arrived, she smiled. "He was always that way," Sarah said softly. "He never thought twice about helping someone else. It's one of the things I loved most about him. But it wasn't just the big things he did. It was the little things, too. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he always made sure there was coffee waiting for me in the morning." Her voice cracked slightly, and Ethan could see how much she still missed him. Jack had been a man who gave everything for the people he loved, and it seemed that even now, years later, his memory still had that same effect on Sarah. "I never thought I'd see you again," Sarah continued. "When I heard the news about Jack, I thought I'd lost everything. And then I lost you too. You disappeared for years, and I couldn't understand it. But now you're here, and I'm glad you came. Jack would have wanted it that way. He always said you were the closest thing to a brother he ever had."
Ethan felt his heart tighten.
Sarah had no idea what kind of struggle he had gone through in the years after the war. He had been trying to find his place in a world that felt completely different from the one he had known before. But now, sitting here with Sarah, he realized that maybe, just maybe, this was where he belonged. This was where Jack's legacy could live on, not just in memories, but in action. "I promised him I would look after you," Ethan said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I've been trying to figure out what that means, what I'm supposed to do, but I'm here now, Sarah, and I'll do whatever I can to make sure you and the kids are safe." Sarah looked at him, her eyes soft with understanding. "I know you will," she said. "You always did keep your promises." Jack would have been proud. For a moment the silence hung between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with understanding, with an unspoken acknowledgement of the difficult road that lay ahead. Ethan had come to honor Jack, but in doing so he had found a new purpose. He wasn't just here to remember a man he had lost. He was here to protect the family Jack had left behind, to honor the promise he had made all those years ago. The conversation shifted after that. They spoke of the future, of what Sarah needed, and what Ethan could do to help. It wasn't just about providing for her financially, or protecting her from danger. It was about being there, about being a part of their lives. Jack had been the one who kept them all grounded, but now it was Ethan's turn to do the same. He didn't know exactly what that would look like, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he could be a part of something again. As the evening came to a close, Ethan stood up to leave. Sarah walked him to the door, and for the first time he saw the flicker of hope in her eyes. She wasn't as alone as she had thought. She had a family now, even if it was different from what she had imagined. She had Ethan. And for the first time, Ethan felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. The next few days after Ethan's conversation with Sarah felt like a blur. He had come to town with a clear purpose in mind, to honor Jack, to keep the promise he had made. But now it seemed like everything had changed. He had expected to feel a sense of closure, maybe even relief, but instead he felt a growing sense of responsibility. The promise he had made to Jack was no longer just about remembering the past. It was about the future. It was about Sarah and the family Jack had left behind, and it was about him stepping up in ways he never thought he would have to. It wasn't just the memories of the war that haunted Ethan. It was the weight of Jack's absence. Jack had been the kind of man who made everyone around him feel safe. He was the protector, the one everyone turned to when things got tough. Ethan had always admired that about him, but now, sitting with Sarah and the children, he realized how much they had all lost. Jack wasn't just a comrade. He was a father, a husband, a friend, and without him, Sarah had been forced to carry everything on her own. The thought of that weighed heavily on Ethan. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself spending more time with Sarah. It started with small things, like helping around the house or running errands for her. There was nothing grand, but it was enough to show Sarah that he was there for her, that he wasn't going anywhere. He spent time with the kids, too, getting to know them a little better, trying to fill in the gaps left by Jack's absence. At first, Ethan felt like a stranger in their lives. He didn't know how to step in, how to fill the space Jack had left behind, but slowly, he began to see how much Sarah appreciated his presence. It wasn't that she needed help with the chores or the kids. It was that she needed someone to share the burden with. Jack had been her partner, her equal. Now she had to carry everything on her own, and that was a heavy load to bear. One evening after the kids had gone to bed, Sarah invited Ethan to sit with her on the porch. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, and the air was cool. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel peaceful, like the world was holding its breath. "I've been thinking," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady but full of emotion. "Jack would have been proud of you for coming back. I know he would have wanted you to be here." Ethan looked at her, his heart heavy with the truth of her words. He hadn't known how to react when Sarah had first thanked him, but now he understood. Jack had always been the one to protect them, to keep them safe. And now, in a way, Ethan had taken up that mantle. He wasn't Jack, and he knew he could never replace him. But he could be there. He could be a steady presence in their lives. That was all he could offer. "I'm not trying to replace Jack," Ethan said softly, his voice filled with sincerity. "I know I'll never be able to do that, but I'm here for you. I always will be." Sarah nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I know you won't replace him. No one ever could. But Jack would have wanted me to move on. He would have wanted me to be happy, to live my life. And for a long time I didn't know how to do that. I couldn't imagine a future without him. But now, I'm starting to see that maybe there's still something worth living for."
The words stung, but Ethan understood.
He had felt the same way after the war. For so long, he had been consumed by guilt, by the weight of Jack's sacrifice. He had felt like he wasn't worthy of the life he had been given. But Sarah's words reminded him of something important, that life was still worth living, even after the hardest losses. They sat in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The sounds of the night filled the space between them, the rustle of leaves in the trees, the distant chirp of crickets. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. The world, for just a brief moment, felt right again. As the weeks passed, Ethan became a constant presence in Sarah's life. He wasn't trying to be a replacement for Jack. He wasn't trying to take his place. He was simply there to help, to support, and to show Sarah that she wasn't alone. He spent more time with the children, taking them on small trips into town, helping them with their schoolwork, and doing whatever he could to make their lives a little easier. But it wasn't just the kids who appreciated him. Sarah, too, began to rely on Ethan more and more. He had become a steady presence in her life, a reminder that she wasn't alone in the world. It was clear that she had grown to trust him, to depend on him. And while it wasn't a romantic relationship yet, there was something undeniably comforting about their growing connection. One afternoon, after a long day of working on the farm, Sarah invited Ethan to stay for dinner. It was a simple meal: roast chicken, potatoes, and a salad. But there was something about it that felt significant. It was the first time they had shared a meal together as a family, and Ethan couldn't help but notice how at home he felt. It was strange. He had spent so many years alone trying to find a place for himself in a world that had never felt quite right. But here, with Sarah and her children, he finally felt like he belonged. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in years, Ethan realized that maybe he could find a sense of peace here, in this small corner of the world. As they ate, Sarah smiled at him, her eyes warm. "You've been a big help, Ethan. I don't know what I would have done without you." Ethan shook his head, feeling humbled by her words. "I'm just doing what Jack would have wanted. I'm just trying to keep my promise." She nodded, her smile fading slightly. "Jack would have wanted you to be happy too. You don't have to carry all of this on your own."
Ethan wasn't sure how to respond.
He had spent so much time focusing on what Jack had wanted for him and Sarah, but he had never really stopped to think about what he wanted for himself. The idea of happiness seemed foreign to him, like something he didn't deserve. But as he sat at the table with Sarah and the children, he began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he could start to build a life here. A life that wasn't haunted by the past, but one that looked forward to the future. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan found himself growing closer to Sarah and her children. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time he felt like he was on the right path. He had come to honor Jack's memory, to keep a promise, but in doing so, he had found something more. He had found a family. And as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of the small room he had been staying in, he realized that maybe, just maybe, he had found a place where he could finally heal. A place where the ghosts of the past didn't haunt him so fiercely. It wasn't easy. It wasn't perfect. But it was real. And for Ethan, that was enough. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan slowly began to feel like he was finding his place in the world once more. The days were filled with work on the farm, with Sarah and the kids, and with the quiet satisfaction of knowing he was doing what he had promised Jack he would do. But as much as he had tried to settle into his new life, something was stirring just beneath the surface. The small, peaceful town had always felt like a safe place, but lately it had begun to feel less so. It started with small rumors. Whispers of a group causing trouble on the outskirts of town. At first, Ethan didn't think much of it. It wasn't unusual for there to be talk like that when people were stressed or uncertain. But then, things started to happen. First, there was a break-in at the local store. Then, a few of the town's fences were cut down, and livestock was found missing. People started locking their doors earlier, and the community's sense of safety was fading. Ethan knew that when a town started to feel unsafe, it wasn't just the property that was at risk. It was the people. He could see the worry in Sarah's eyes when she spoke about the threats that had been happening, even if she tried to hide it. He knew she didn't want to burden him, but he could see it in the way she looked at the children, the way her shoulders seemed to sag after a long day. As the threat of danger grew closer, Ethan felt a shift within himself. He had come to town to honor Jack's memory, to protect Jack's family, but now he had to protect them in a different way. The promise he had made wasn't just about making sure they were well taken care of. It was about keeping them safe from harm, even if it meant facing danger head-on. One evening, as the sun began to set and the air grew cooler, Sarah asked Ethan to walk with her. The kids were in bed, and there was a quiet calm that settled over the house. But even in the quiet, there was tension. "Ethan," Sarah said softly, her voice trembling just a bit, "I know you've been hearing the rumors, and I don't want you to think you have to protect us. I can take care of the kids. We've made it this far." Ethan stopped walking for a moment and turned to look at her. He could see the weariness in her eyes, the strength that had always been there, but now it was starting to fray at the edges. She wasn't the same woman he had met when Jack was still alive. She was tired, burdened by responsibilities that had been too much for one person to carry. "Sarah," Ethan said gently, "you don't have to do this alone. I promised Jack I'd look after you. And I will. If something is happening out there, I'll make sure we're ready for it. I can't stand by and let something happen to you or the kids." She hesitated for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I know. I just don't want you to feel like you have to fight someone else's fight. Jack would have known what to do. He always did." Ethan took a deep breath, his heart heavy with the weight of the words. Jack had always been the one with the answers. Jack had always known how to lead, how to protect, how to face any challenge without fear. But Jack wasn't here anymore, and Ethan knew deep down that it was up to him now. The next morning, Ethan set out to find out more about the trouble that had been brewing. He wasn't sure who he was dealing with, but he was certain that it wasn't just the work of a few troublemakers. There was something bigger going on. People in the town were scared, and when people were scared, they often made reckless decisions. The more Ethan learned, the more he realized how serious the situation was becoming. The whispers had turned into threats, and the threats were getting closer. Ethan knew what he had to do. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but he still had the instincts that had kept him alive all those years ago. It was time to take action before things got worse. That night, as the air grew colder and the stars appeared in the sky, Ethan gathered his thoughts and made a decision. He would take the first step, and he wouldn't back down. It wasn't just about Jack's memory anymore. It was about his own place in this world. It was about making sure the family he had come to care for didn't have to live in fear. He met with a few trusted people in town the next day, people who weren't afraid to speak up. They discussed what had been happening, and slowly a plan began to form. Ethan knew it wouldn't be easy. It wasn't a matter of just running off to confront the group causing trouble. He needed to be smart about this. He needed to gather information, find out who was behind it all, and be prepared to defend the people who mattered most. As the plan took shape, Ethan could see Sarah's worry lines deepening. She had always been strong, always carried herself with a quiet grace, but now, even she seemed unsure of how to handle what was coming, the weight of everything. Jack's death, the kids, the threat looming over them, was too much for her to carry alone. Ethan could see it in her eyes. She was exhausted, but she was trying not to show it.
That evening, as they sat together in the kitchen, Sarah finally spoke the words that had been hanging between them for weeks.
"I don't know what to do, Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want to believe that we'll be okay, that we'll find a way through this. But it feels like everything's falling apart. Jack isn't here to protect us, and I don't know what we're supposed to do now."
Ethan reached across the table and took her hand in his.
He didn't know exactly what the future held, but he knew he had to be strong for Sarah and the kids. Jack had been the protector, the leader, but now it was his turn. "We'll get through this," he said firmly. "You're not alone. I'm here. We'll make sure the kids are safe. We'll make sure you're safe." The words were simple, but they were the truth. And in that moment, as Sarah looked at him, her face softening just a little, Ethan knew that he was doing the right thing. He was taking the steps to protect the people he cared about, just as Jack had once done for him. The days ahead would be difficult. The challenge they faced wasn't just about physical threats. It was about trust, about facing the unknown, and about learning to rely on each other in ways they hadn't before. But Ethan was ready. He had made his choice. He was no longer the man who wandered, uncertain of where he belonged. He had a purpose now, a family to protect, and he wouldn't let anything threaten their future. By the time the first light of dawn broke the horizon, Ethan had made up his mind. He would do whatever it took to protect Sarah, her children, and the town that had become his home. He wasn't just keeping a promise anymore. He was fighting for something worth fighting for, and that made all the difference. The days following Ethan's decision to step up and protect Sarah and her family passed in a whirlwind of planning, gathering information, and preparing for whatever might come next. It wasn't easy. Ethan had always been a soldier, someone who acted quickly when faced with danger. But this was different. The stakes weren't just about him anymore. The stakes were about the people he had come to care for deeply. People who were depending on him to be their protector, to be their shield when the world outside their little town started to turn dark. Ethan spent his days learning more about the group causing trouble. He didn't want to jump into anything blindly. He needed to understand who they were, why they were causing chaos, and what their end goal was. The more he learned, the more he realized just how dangerous they were. They weren't just a group of people causing petty problems. They had a purpose, and that purpose wasn't going to stop until they had what they wanted. Ethan didn't know if that meant threatening the town or something worse, but he knew one thing for sure. They had to be stopped before they could do any more damage. As the days went on, Sarah grew more concerned, but she tried not to show it. Ethan could see the worry in her eyes whenever they spoke about the situation, but she refused to let it control her. She was doing her best to keep things as normal as possible for the kids, even when it felt like the world around them was slowly starting to crack. Ethan admired that strength. He knew how much she had already been through, how much she had carried on her shoulders, but it was clear that the weight of the unknown was starting to get to her. One evening after dinner, Sarah invited Ethan to sit on the porch with her again. The night was quiet, the air cool with the scent of pine and fresh earth. The kids were playing in the yard, their laughter filling the air. For a moment it felt like everything was okay. But Ethan knew that wasn't the truth. The storm was coming, and he could feel it in the air. "I've been thinking," Sarah began softly, looking out at the horizon. "I don't know how much longer we can keep going like this, Ethan. I can see how hard you're working to keep us safe, but I can't help but wonder, what if it's not enough?" Ethan turned to look at her, his heart heavy with the weight of her words. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, clearly struggling to keep her emotions in check.
I mean, what if this doesn't go the way we hope? What if something happens to you?
To the kids? She paused, her voice catching in her throat. "I don't know if I can handle that. I don't know if I can lose anyone else." Ethan felt his heart ache for her. He had always known Sarah was strong, but he hadn't realized how much she had been carrying, how much she had been holding inside. Jack's death had torn her apart, and now she was afraid of losing everything all over again. "Sarah, look at me," Ethan said gently, reaching out to take her hand. "I'm not going anywhere. I made a promise to Jack, and I'm going to keep it. You and the kids will be safe. I won't let anything happen to you." She squeezed his hand, but her eyes were full of uncertainty.
I want to believe you, Ethan.
"But I don't know if I can. I've been doing this on my own for so long, and I don't know how to trust again." Ethan understood. Trust wasn't something that could be rebuilt overnight, but he also knew that this was the moment when they had to come together, when they had to face the challenges ahead as a team. If they were going to make it through this, they would need to lean on each other. Ethan had always been a solitary figure, but now he had a family to protect, and that meant he had to be stronger than ever. "We're in this together, Sarah," he said firmly. "We'll face whatever comes next together. I won't let you do this alone." She smiled faintly, her eyes filled with gratitude, but there was still a sadness there, a lingering fear. Ethan knew that it wasn't enough to just promise her safety. They needed to act, to take the steps necessary to secure their future. The group causing the trouble had to be stopped, and Ethan was ready to do whatever it took to make that happen. The next few days were filled with preparations. Ethan continued to meet with the townspeople, gathering information, making sure that everyone was aware of the danger they were facing. It wasn't just about protecting Sarah and her family anymore. It was about protecting the entire town. Ethan had grown up in a world where people looked out for each other, where communities were built on trust and mutual support. And that's exactly what he was going to do. He would bring the town together, make sure they all understood what was at stake. As the day of confrontation approached, the tension in the air was thick. People in town had begun to gather their belongings, locking up their homes and preparing for whatever might come. Ethan knew that there was no turning back now. The moment was coming when he would have to face the people causing the chaos and put a stop to it before it was too late. The night before the confrontation, Ethan sat alone in his small room, staring out the window at the moonlit sky. He thought about everything that had brought him to this point. He had come to this town a broken man, haunted by guilt and the weight of his past. But now he had a purpose. He had a family to protect, a legacy to honor, and he was ready to do whatever it took to defend them. When morning came, Ethan stood up, dressed in his boots and coat, and walked out to meet the people who would help him face the threat head-on. He wasn't doing this alone. He had a team, a community that would stand beside him. Together, they would face whatever dangers were out there and make sure that no one else would have to suffer. Ethan and the group made their way to the outskirts of town, where they knew the group causing trouble had been gathering. As they approached, Ethan's heart raced. He knew that what happened next would change everything for them all. But he also knew that they had no choice. If they didn't take action now, the threat would only grow. It was time to face it head-on. The confrontation was tense. Words were exchanged, threats were made, but in the end, Ethan and the townspeople stood firm. The group causing the trouble quickly realized that they were outnumbered, outmatched. They didn't expect the town to come together the way it did, and in the end, they were forced to retreat. It was over. The town was safe again. But as Ethan walked back to Sarah's house, he realized something. The victory wasn't just about defeating the threat. It was about the bond he had formed with Sarah, with her children, and with the town. They had faced danger together, and together they had emerged stronger. As Ethan stood on the porch looking out at the peaceful town, he felt a sense of peace wash over him. He had kept his promise to Jack. He had protected the family he had come to care for, and in doing so he had found a place where he truly belonged, a place where he could finally heal. And as the sun set behind him, casting a warm glow over the town, Ethan knew that whatever the future held, he was ready. He wasn't the man he had been before. He had a new purpose now, a new family, and he would do everything he could to protect them.